What's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and in this episode of Coding with the Force, we're going to find out all about lifecycle hooks in Lightning Web Components. We'll figure out what they are, when to use each one of them, and why they're so useful when you're building your Lightning Web Components. Alright guys, so today we are going to be taking a look at what lifecycle hooks are in Lightning Web Components. And outside of learning basic JavaScript so that you can just get started writing Lightning Web Components, learning what these lifecycle hooks are and when to use them is probably one of the most valuable things that you can do. And that's because these lifecycle hooks allow you to, throughout the different lifecycle stages of a component, either prep it, before it's presented to the user. So, prep some data for them, or prep CSS based on different situations or whatever else, the look and feel of the component, or clean up things left over by your component in the case that you are removing it from the user interface or, from the page, right? So these are really, really important and extremely useful. And, I find all too often people don't know much about anything outside of maybe connectedCallback, or maybe they don't even know it exists. So, so today we're going to take a look at that. And what you can see in front of me right now is just a basic Lightning Web Component that has each one of the lifecycle hooks in front of it, just so that you can kind of see what these look like before I go over the lifecycle flow in just a second. So this way, you see them, they don't look, it doesn't look too weird when I'm going over this lifecycle flow here in a moment. So the different lifecycle hooks that you can use are constructor, and these just look like methods, right? So it's not anything wild or crazy or out of the ordinary, but these are methods that are just available to you in a Lightning Web Component, and they run based on where a component is in its life cycle, as in, has it been loaded into the DOM yet? Has it been, rendered to the user yet? All those kind of things, which we'll go over some more. So we've got the constructor lifecycle hook, the connectedCallback lifecycle hook, the renderedCallback lifecycle hook, the rendered method. I wouldn't say that it's actually a lifecycle hook. I think Salesforce even says it's not a lifecycle hook, but most people include it in this conversation, so I'm going to include it here. There's the rendered method, the disconnectedCallback lifecycle hook, and the errorCallback lifecycle hook. And today we are going to go over each and every one of them and figure out when you should use one over the other, and most importantly, when these get called when your component loads or unloads from a page, right? So let's go over that real quick and take a look at this lifecycle flow. So we just took a look in Visual Studio Code at all the different lifecycle hooks that are available to us, but now we need to figure out, when are those lifecycle hooks called, by our component, and when should we actually use them, right? If ever. So the first thing that we'll take a look at is the constructor lifecycle hook. So if we're looking at this lifecycle flow, just pretend that this big green dot is your component. And right now, your component is beginning to load into your user interface or the page that the user's looking at, right? So we've got our Lightning Web Component. It's starting to load into the page. And the first thing that gets called is your constructor on whatever your top level parent component is. If you have no idea about this, you can actually, take one Lightning component and place another Lightning component within it, right? So you can create two separate Lightning components and place one inside another. The top level component would be the parent, and the one that gets placed inside it would be its child, right? We'll take a look at that in the code actually in just a little bit. But the first thing that happens is whatever that top level parent component is, its constructor method that we just took a look at, this guy, it's called. And the important thing about the constructor method is, as you can see, The constructor gets called before this component even gets inserted into the page, right? Before it's there physically or, whatever, digitally for, within that page that it's being loaded into. So in the constructor, you can't, make updates to the look and feel of your component because it's not there yet to be manipulated. So if you wanted to change the CSS of your component or something, you can't do that yet. The other thing is, as you can see, we don't have our child components loaded in yet. So in a constructor, you can't access your child components and you can't do anything with them. And then the third thing is, you may know that these exist, you may not, but if you're using a public variable or an API decorated variable that accesses something like the record ID of a record that this Lightning Web Component is on, or the object API name of that record or something like that, those are also not available in the constructor. So there is a limited number of things that you can do in a constructor, and we'll go over those more, but really you're going to potentially prep data that you can prep without those things within your constructor ahead of time, right? And we'll take a look at that in just a moment. All right, so the constructor method gets called, and after the constructor method gets called, the component gets inserted into the DOM. That's the document object model or the user interface that a user is taking a look at. And after it gets inserted into the document object model, the connectedCallback method gets called. So this guy right here. And now that we're in the connectedCallback, we have two new things that are accessible to us. We have the, it's actually in the page now. Your Lightning Web Component is in the page. So we can access, in our parent component anyway, elements of that component and change its style, its CSS, whatever. At that point, you still can't deal with the child components because they're not loaded yet. But in the connectedCallback, you can potentially alter the style of your parent component at the very least. And you now have access to those public API decorated variables like the record ID or the object API name. So you can go out and query, for data related to that record ID or whatever else at this point. So connectedCallback basically has everything accessible to it outside of the child components. So, at this point. So, all right. So the connectedCallback is called on the parent, and then the parent gets rendered in the page. And then what happens is once the parent gets rendered, we then call the constructor on the child components and basically do this exact same process on all of our children components within our, parent. So the child components constructor gets called, the child gets inserted into the user interface, the connectedCallback is called on the child, and then the child gets rendered. And then what happens is important. The child's renderedCallback lifecycle hook, again, this guy right here, gets called. And after the child's, all the children renderedCallback methods get called, then the parent's renderedCallback gets called. So the last thing to kind of occur is the parent's renderedCallback method. So within this here, the renderedCallback, you now have access to your child components, right? You don't in connectedCallback, you don't in constructor, but in renderedCallback, your child components are there. So you can now potentially reach out to them and ask them to do things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to in those other lifecycle hooks. The last lifecycle hook that we're going to go over in this flow anyway is the disconnectedCallback. And basically what the disconnectedCallback does is when you are removing your Lightning Web Component from the user interface, it gets called, and you can do things to potentially clean up cache data or a ton of other things, and we'll take a look at those as well. But when you remove your Lightning Web Component from the user interface, its disconnected callback gets called on the parent, and then subsequently all of its children have their disconnected callbacks called as well. So, all right, now there's still two other lifecycle hooks that we didn't talk about. So we talked about disconnected callback, rendered callback, connected callback, and constructor. But we didn't talk about this render method. We didn't talk about the error callback lifecycle hook. And this error callback lifecycle hook is basically going to allow you on your parent component to have errors get sent back to you from your child components if anything goes wrong when they're loading or when an event handler fails on them. So this can be really useful with error handling. It's kind of like a catch block in JavaScript or in Apex. Yeah, so this is really good to a good lifecycle hook that allows you to kind of potentially present more user-friendly errors instead of just having your component crash and burn, right? And then this rendered method is not really a lifecycle hook, but it's, again, it's brought up with lifecycle hooks almost always in the docs. It's there as well. But basically, this will allow you to render an HTML template. So maybe your component is complex enough that in one scenario, one template needs to be loaded, and in another scenario, a different HTML template or look and feel of your component needs to be loaded. This guy comes in handy for that, which is what we'll take a look at here in a minute. So now that we know the flow of these lifecycle hooks and kind of how things are working within that flow, let's just take a look at what you should probably do in these different lifecycle hooks. So let's start with constructor, since that's the first one that runs. In a constructor lifecycle hook, personally, I will do as much prep work as I can get done that does not rely on, a publicly accessible or an API decorated variable. So for instance, if I needed the record ID, if you didn't know, if I placed this on a record page and I use this add API record ID, then it's just going to give me, the Lightning Web Component is going to be smart enough to figure out what the ID of that record is and give me that record ID. Well, anything that I can do to prep, my component without the use of these API decorated, public properties or public variables is what I'm going to do in this constructor. So, for instance, I might be able to pull data from labels in Salesforce, right, and pump those into different variables or something. Actually, that's a pretty bad example, but maybe custom metadata, right? Maybe I need to prep some of this with custom metadata. And so what I can do is in my constructor, I can call out to an Apex class, pull down some custom metadata, and get all of that, custom metadata related information prepped in different variables. So for instance, if I had a variable up here or a property up here that was like, custom metadata records or something along those lines, then in here, what I could do in the constructor is I could call out to an Apex class, pull that down, and set custom metadata records equal to whatever I had queried for in my Apex class. So this particular lifecycle hook is really good at, it's really useful for prepping all of that preliminary information that you can get without the use of these public properties, right? That's what I'd suggest using it for. Yeah. So anything that you need done that doesn't revolve around these, get it done in the constructor. All right, now on to the connected callback lifecycle hook. Probably the most popular lifecycle hook in Lightning Web Components, the one that you'll probably see used most often if you just went out into the world of Lightning Web Components and surveyed them all. Connected callback is got to be at the near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list, and that's because at this point in the lifecycle, your component has loaded into the DOM, is loaded in to the UI, so you can make those UI preparations, those changes, whatever else, and you now have access to these public properties, these API decorated properties, and that's extremely useful. In the case of record ID, now I can query for information about my particular record and potentially any other records related to it. And also, if you were unaware, you can create your own public properties that aren't pre-prepped by Salesforce, like record ID. So maybe I wanted a public property called actually like render cool template or something like that, right? Maybe I have two different templates that I may render under condition A or condition B. Well, I can actually create these for users who place this component in their page to set themselves, right? And I actually have a video that goes over this quite a bit more, but you can create these things called target configs and create properties, and basically what this allows you to do is when a user drops this component in the Lightning App Builder or something, now on the right hand side it's going to present them with a list of properties, these properties that you've defined here. And so in this case I've got a Boolean, and I can check that Boolean on and off to indicate whether or not I wanted to render the cool template or not render the cool template, right? Probably something more meaningful in your case. Also, I'm realizing I didn't change this as exposed. You definitely need to change this to true, because when we start dropping this into a page, if you're following along, it won't be available unless is exposed is set to true. So now that you're in connected callback, again, these public properties are available to you, which means that you can do a whole lot more. And additionally, your component it's not visible to the user yet, but it is placed in the DOM or into the UI. So you can start to change its look and feel before the user actually sees it. Because if you remember, if we take a look at the lifecycle flow, even though the parent, our component is inserted into the DOM or into the UI, it's not rendered yet, when the connected callback is called. So we've got time at this point to set up our Lightning Web Component how we would like it to be presented based on, all the information that we have, up until now, right? So for instance, if somebody had checked render cool template, maybe I want to change up a bunch of the CSS on my component for one reason or another. Or now that I've got the record ID, I want to pull in a bunch of records from a controller, an Apex controller, to present in a data table, right? In a Lightning data table or something. And now I can do all that stuff in connected callback, which is great. So, once you get to the connected callback, you've got a wealth of opportunity in front of you, I guess. You'll be able to pull in those public properties, and you'll be able to start manipulating the look and the feel of your component. But the one thing that you can't do yet is call out to a child component. So, for instance, if in here I had another component that I was calling to, maybe my Christmas magic component that I made. I wasn't necessarily calling out to, but another component that I've embedded in here. If there was publicly accessible things on this component that I wanted to access, I still could not do that in connectedCallback because this component still hasn't gone through its lifecycle phases yet, right? It's not available yet. So this is, by the way, this is what I mean by a child component. This child component here is essentially a component within a component. And if you didn't see my video on Christmas magic, you can see over here in the left side here that I've got a Lightning Web component called Christmas Magic. And basically what this is going to do is embed that into this one, right? Which is pretty cool. So it becomes the child component of my lifecycle hook demo component. So again, connectedCallback, you're ready to go with public properties and with restyling or styling your parent component here, but you still can't access your children components. Now, connectedCallback is good for a lot of things on top of that. So I'm going to list these. I'm not going to go over each one of them in a lot of detail because some of them are kind of complicated. But a lot of times you'll also see in connectedCallback, setting up event listeners in JavaScript. If you've never done that, you'll see that happen quite often in connectedCallback. Now your component is loaded into the DOM, so you can set up those event listeners on different elements within your component. You'll often see people set up caching in connectedCallback. That's a pretty popular one. So if you're doing like local storage caching or something along those lines in JavaScript, you'll see that done quite a bit in the connectedCallback. And if you're using Lightning messaging service to communicate with, another component that lives in its own world, then you'll see people start to subscribe to those Lightning messaging service things in connectedCallback as well. So connectedCallback, you'll really start to see a lot of stuff being done within this particular lifecycle hook. Okay. The last thing I should say about connectedCallback is it can get called multiple times. Typically, you won't see connectedCallback called multiple times unless your component is rendered and then unrendered from a page and then re-rendered, right? Which can happen. If you have a form that's like multiple pages, maybe you render page 1 and then you go next and then you unrender it and you render page 2 and then you go back and then you re-render page 1, right? In a situation like that where the template gets rendered and then unrendered, connectedCallback can be called multiple times. So you need to be aware in that situation where you're kind of rendering and unrendering your component that this can happen again. So if you want certain things to not happen more than once, ever, in your components, in this connectedCallback, you're going to have to make sure that you ensure that's the case, right? Especially in those multi-page scenarios where you're rendering and unrendering things. There's lots of other scenarios like that as well. It's not ultra common that you get into that scenario, but I've got myself into it. I'm sure plenty of other people have, and it's good to know when connectedCallback can kind of get called twice, right? Because a lot of people just assume it can only be called once, and it's just not true. Okay, so the next lifecycle hook here is renderedCallback. And this is a lifecycle hook when child components become available to you to communicate with. But this is also the most dangerous lifecycle hook. And the reason that it's the most dangerous lifecycle hook is because it's called relatively often. And the reason that it's called relatively often is because in a normal component, you've maybe got a property like cool text, and it's equal to something, I don't know, cool. And over here in your HTML template, you've got a paragraph tag like so, and it has cool text placed in here, right? So now, if you didn't know, this is how you can take a variable from your JavaScript, cool text, and make it visible within the HTML, right, in your Lightning Web model. Well, now anytime cool text gets changed, so, maybe I change cool text somewhere in my component, maybe I click a button, or I create a button and I click it and cool text changes, your component will call the renderedCallback method. And it will call the renderedCallback method because you changed cool text and cool text is present in your template, right? In your HTML template. And so that's really, really important to know that anytime you change a variable that is present in your HTML template, this renderedCallback method is going to get called. And what I see people do far too often is they're not aware of that. They just kind of assume that it's like the last in the line of the lifecycle hook and it gets called once and then you're done. That's absolutely not the case, right? And this gets called more often than any other lifecycle hook because of what I just showed you. So it's really important in renderedCallback to not set any of these variables, or be very, very cautious if you're setting a variable that's also present in here of that scenario. Because what you could get yourself into is you set the variable and then it re-renders your template and then it just gets caught in a loop and it keeps re-rendering and re-rendering and re-rendering. And I see people get confused about this quite often, actually. But yeah, so just so you're aware, this gets called a lot. And people, get into some tricky situations for it. So make sure if you're using renderedCallback for anything to be knowledgeable of that scenario, knowledgeable of when this actually runs, because it runs more often than not. Yeah, just be very careful with it. Create variables that stop it from, running in certain situations and all that. So, as far as when you use renderedCallback, again, this is when you can start to communicate with your child component. So if you need to immediately, on the load of everything, right, start to call out to your child components and, either alter them or prep them for what's coming, you can do so in renderedCallback. Another thing that I also see people do quite a bit in renderedCallback, which I don't, maybe I'm missing something, but I don't necessarily think you need to, is if you're loading JavaScript or CSS files from a static resource. I see a lot of people do that in renderedCallback, but quite frankly, you can do it in connectedCallback and it works just fine. So, at least in all of my experimentation. So if, you'll see a lot of people bring in static resources in renderedCallback. I don't necessarily know that you need to. It normally works just fine here, but you'll see that suggested a lot. It's not necessarily wrong. I just, again, renderedCallback gets called so much. I don't know that I want to pull in static resources that much. I mean, if nothing else, you can put a Boolean in here that says static resources loaded and make sure that you don't do it more than once, right? If you want to do that from there. But yeah, biggest thing for rendered callback is it's called a lot. Child components are now available, so you can actually call out to them and do stuff. You can maybe set up event listeners on your child components. I've certainly done that before. So yeah, rendered callback is great for that stuff, but be very careful, because anytime these variables that also exist in your HTML template get updated, rendered callback gets called. So, all right, the render component, the render method, which is not a lifecycle hook, but rather a method that you can override, basically. This allows you to change the template that's being rendered for your users and the user experience. So for instance, right now I have one template. It's this lifecycle hooks demo HTML, right? But maybe in different scenarios, I wanted different templates to be rendered. Maybe if they're using a mobile phone, I want a mobile template to be rendered, or a tablet template, or whatever, right? And this is your opportunity to do that. The rendered method here is going to allow you to do that. And I'm going to show you how to do this really quick, because I think people get really, really confused about this. So I'm going to go over it. So you've got this HTML template already, right? This is the one when you create your LWC, it's just pre-built with that. So this is the one that by default is going to load, right? But maybe I want a different one, different options, again, based on device type or something. And so what I can do is I can create a new file inside my LWC folder, and I can call it, I don't know, we'll call it mobile template.html, right? And it's going to complain because we don't have a template tag up at the top, but now we do. And in here, I'm just going to put in a paragraph tag and put in a bind variable called mobile text or something, right? So I've got this template, I've got my other template, and I'm going to put in, I'm going to change this actually to desktop text or something like that. And back up here, change this to desktop text. And then I'll create another variable called mobile text, like so. And last but not least, we'll import our new template. To import that template, basically, we're just going to import it like we would anything else. We'll give it a name. We'll call it the mobile template. And that // means within our current LWC folder, right? Because we made that within the folder. And then we called this mobile template.html. Oops, like so. And then we'll also import this other template that just kind of got pre-built for us, Lifecycle Hooks Demo. And we'll call it the desktop template. And we'll say, oops, Lifecycle Hooks Demo.html, like so. And then, down here in render, we can, you can actually check device type pretty easily. I have a video where I show you how to do that in under a minute. But I'm not going to do that here just for simplicity's sake and so that we can easily test this. I'm just going to put a variable in here that says, render mobile is equal to true. And in here, in render, you can say, if this dot render mobile. Actually, it's true. Then return mobile template. Else return desktop template, like so. So basically what this render method is now going to do is if I'm wanting to render mobile, then I am going to render this mobile template, right? So it's returning that mobile template, that HTML template. Otherwise, I'm going to return the desktop template right here. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So since this is true, and we've got all this set up anyway and saved, and hopefully this will save successfully, let's go over to Salesforce, and I am going to actually place this on a record page. So let's go to edit this page, and we'll place this in the page and see what happens. Actually, you know what? I set up this render cool template thing. So why don't we just have this go off of that? We'll say render cool template. If that is equal to true, then render the mobile one. Otherwise, render that. That way we can actually demo this quite a bit easier, right? What the outcome of this is. So let's save this, and you know, we can kill two birds with one stone. You can see what these publicly accessible properties can do. This guy over here. And we can see how this render method works all at the same time. All right, so back over here in Salesforce, let me reload this. And we'll place this on the page. Once Lightning, you know, figures itself out and recaches everything, and there we go. Okay. So down here we've got Lifecycle Hooks demo, and I'm going to drop that on the page. Oh boy, I forgot I put the Christmas component in there. So right now you can see it's rendering the desktop version because I don't have this checked. It's not true, and if it's false, right, we are going to render the desktop template, which is this Lifecycle Hooks demo, which brings in Christmas magic and the desktop text, and the desktop text was cool. But if we check this box and then go back to the page here in a second, we should see that change. So let's check that box, save it, go back over here, and hopefully it all works. And you can see it did. So we checked that box, it's equal to true. And now instead of Christmas magic loading and the word cool, we just see the words, or the word mobile, which is pretty cool. So basically this render method is going to allow you to change the HTML template that you are using based on different situations. I think the most common one are, you know, mobile and desktop switch ups, I guess. And you can see that these templates can still use bind variables, right? And they can still, you know, right? They can still reference properties in your JavaScript. They can also have, you know, event handlers on them. So you know, you can do as much as you want with different templates, and kind of mix it up based on, you know, whatever you want to mix it up on. And that's what this render lifecycle hook, or really method, is good for. Now, on to the disconnected callback. The disconnected callback is a very useful lifecycle hook that people do not use all that often, and I think they don't use it because they don't use the cache or event listeners as often as maybe they should, right? Those can come in a lot of handy, especially like local storage cache or session cache potentially. A lot of time up here in the connected callback, you'll set like a local storage variable for the cache in a browser, right? And the last thing you want to do is leave all that stuff in the cache when you're done with it. I mean, it's probably not the last thing that you want to do, but it's not the best thing to have laying around. So, for instance, in local storage, I could say, I could have, something like, I don't know, we'll just say data. And we'll make it equal to data, because why not? So we've got a key in local storage called data, and within it, it has a string called data object. I don't know. You could put anything in this though, right? It could be a JSON object, it could be whatever. And down here in disconnected callback, you have an opportunity to get rid of that, right? To clean that up. And really, that's what you should do. When your component leaves the page, unless there is a good reason to not remove this stuff from local storage or from essentially your cache, then in your disconnected callback, you should wipe that cache clean. And the same kind of thing, if you're setting up Lightning messaging service, you should remove your listeners in here more than likely. And I feel like I'm forgetting something. Yeah, and if you have event listeners set up, you should probably remove those as well in your disconnected callback. So your disconnected callback is really a way to kind of remove all the stuff that is now irrelevant because your component is leaving the DOM. It's leaving the user interface. And I don't see many people do this, but they really, you really should consider that. And you should really consider using the local storage cache or, other varieties of cache as well. It can speed up your implementation quite a bit, and very few people use it, in my experience anyway. Okay, and the last one is just this error callback. And basically what the error callback is going to do is, if somewhere down the line of your components here, so for instance, I've got Christmas Magic embedded as a child component in this Lifecycle Hooks demo. If anything goes wrong in that component during its Lifecycle Hooks, or if it had an event custom, an event handler on it, this error callback will grab that. It will, tell you what the error is, and it will tell you, where it occurred, essentially. And what you'll be able to do is, present that in a toast to your users, or present it in your UI to your users that this happened at this point, instead of your component just tanking. I think if you've built enough Lightning Web Components, you probably know what I mean. But if you don't have this error callback in place to kind of do your exception handling or your error catching, then what's going to happen is you're going to get, a pretty ugly, gigantic error that your users aren't going to understand. And this error callback allows you to prevent that, right? So you really want to take advantage of this, and basically it's just going to get, again, it's going to get called if there's any problems in any of those events or lifecycle hooks. And what you can do, is write some code to pop a toast and make things look a whole lot nicer than they would otherwise, right? Okay, so I could obviously go quite a bit more in detail and do examples for each one of these, but I think the really important part is when to use them and what they're used for and when they happen in, the life cycle of your component. And I think we've gone over that. So hopefully this helps you kind of get a better grasp on when to use what and what the usefulness of each lifecycle hook is. If not, definitely leave me comments below. I'm happy to try. I'll try to get to them all. I get a lot of questions these days, but I do my best to get to them eventually. But yeah, hopefully this has helped. Hopefully you now know when each one is used, what the downfalls of each one are, what the upsides are to each one, what to look out for each one, and all that. So if you stuck with me this long, thank you, and I hope I'll see you in the next video.